Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us for another session of Why Marx. We're continuing to look at the Social Democratic Party in Germany, the SPD, which really played a hugely important part in our working class history. It was really the first mass working class party in the world with over 1 million members. It wasn't the first working class party, that was probably the Chartists, but the first one that was really a part of the mass of the working class. How did they do that? What can we learn for our own efforts to build a mass working class communist party today, which is clearly so desperately needed? We're very pleased to have with us Andrew Bonnell, who's a professor in history at the University of Queensland, and he's currently in Berlin. And particularly interesting is his book for us, for our purposes of that's called Red Banners, Books and Beer Mats, The Mental World of German Social Democrats, 1863 to 1914. And I think it really does sum up what the German Social Democrats were all about. So welcome, Andrew. Thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Tina, and I'd like to thank everyone for the kind invitation to talk about stuff I like talking about. I think some of the people online may have been online a few years ago when I was asked to speak about my book, Red Banners, Books and Beer Mugs, not long after it came out. So that was about 4 years ago, I think. And so I hope I'm not repeating too much, but having to think about the question of how the SPD became a mass working class party has helped me to kind of organize my thoughts a little bit and think about it a bit more systematically, as opposed to just digging into the empirical themes that I covered in that book. So I guess when I did my work for that book, which came together over a long period of time, to some extent I was trying to answer the question about how did these social democrats in Germany become so successful until August 1914. Their history is always written, if you like, backwards from the split of the party after August 1914. It's the vote of the party for war credits and the continuing support of the war by the party majority. And so the SPD is always, its history has always been overshadowed by that sort of terrible failure of 1914. And I think I was trying to get to grips with the question, well, how did they become so successful if they were so hopeless in 1914? How did they become so successful in getting, 1 million workers to part with their hard-earned pfennigs on a regular basis to support the party as party members? How did they get out the working class vote so massively before 1914? So how were they so successful in mobilizing a mass working class support base in this rather authoritarian imperial German state? So that was the kind of approach I was trying to take, not just sort of viewing everything in terms of the failure of August 1914, but how did they succeed in mobilizing that mass base before that watershed? So, as Tina mentioned, this is the first mass working class political party of over 1 million members by 1914, and first political party of any persuasion to get that kind of mass membership before the First World War, despite the fact that in Imperial Germany, women were only permitted to join political parties in 1908. Of course, they were still excluded from voting until after the First World War and the collapse of the empire. The party still organized over 170,000 women. It also had its associated trade unions with 2.5 million members, although they were increasingly going a separate way from the political party. The the party continued to increase its vote in every election after it was legalized in 1890. This was after 12 years in which the party is outlawed, banned, all its publications and organizations within Germany outlawed for 12 years, but it still gained strength during that time. And the Social Democrats won over 34% of the vote in 1912, becoming the largest party in the Reichstag, the German parliament, despite the gross malapportionment of electorates. Basically, the electoral map of Germany is not reformed between 1871 and 1912, with a few sort of changes at the edges, but basically you have the same electoral boundaries in 1912 as you have in 1871, despite the massive growth in cities during this period, which leads to enormous disparities in the sizes of electorates, massively favours conservative rural electorates. But despite this disadvantage, the Social Democrats still become the largest party in the parliament by 1912. And the more you read about what people in the German ruling elites are writing to each other in the years leading up to 1914, the German ruling classes are clearly very apprehensive of what the next scheduled Reichstag elections in 1911 would bring. I mean, the ruling classes don't really see a way out of the potential parliamentary deadlock that's looming by 1917 if the normal elections had taken place. So despite the internal programmatic differences that are probably well known in this group, and if you've just done the Gotha program, you know a great deal about that. Despite these internal programmatic differences, the party still remains united. And it still remains united under a program that, at least in theory, is Marxist and revolutionary until the First World War broke the party's unity. And I think there's a great premium placed by people in the party on the concept of unity that they've learned through labour struggles, that if the workers are divided, then they're going to lose. And so unity does become a sort of strong value that the party sticks behind until the crisis of the First World War. There's also, I think, significant evidence that a broad majority of rank and file German Social Democrats endorsed the party's Marxist interpretation of the imperial German state. They see it as a class state, a form of class domination. They're opposed to the rule of the Junkers and the capitalists. They're opposed to militarism, although the party program always allows for the concept of national self-defense, however that's defined. They're opposed to colonialism and imperialism, and the party rank and file also expressed strong opposition to the monarchical and aristocratic dominated political system, as well as demanding the 8-hour day and material improvements in workers' lives. So as well as those more sort of trade unionist demands, such as the 8-hour day and better material conditions for workers, the rank and file also, on the whole, strongly support the Marxian political critique of the imperial German state and its militarism and imperialism, etc. And so I think there's evidence that there is very strong buy-in to the Marxist theory among the rank and file, which I'll say a bit more about shortly. So I think all of these things can be seen as successors of German social democracy before 1914. And this talk, as I said, gives me the opportunity to reflect more systematically on the reasons for this success. Now, one should, of course, always start with the socio-economic material base. And in Germany, you have a very highly visible. You can't sort of avoid the sort of rapid restructuring of German society on class lines, with the emergence of a massive industrial working class from between about the 1840s to the 1910s. There's an early break of social democracy, working class social democracy, with middle class liberalism in terms of political parties. I know Tina mentioned the Chartists, but if you look at the emergence of a British Labour Party, they break with liberalism much later than happens in Germany, interestingly. There's the repressive nature of the imperial German state, even though there's still some rule of law in that state, but very much class bound. There's the ideological clarification of the party during its period of illegality, and the adoption of a Marxist program in 1891, the Erfurt program. While the Erfurt program's been strongly criticized by many non-Marxist historians and some Marxist historians, I would argue that the Erfurt synthesis was of great positive value for the growth of social democracy after 1891. So looking then at the formation of the German working class, I mean, Germany experiences quite a rapid and concentrated so-called takeoff phase of a later industrial revolution, dramatic growth rates in the 1850s to 1870s. And this is driving dramatic urbanization, driven by very rapid concentration of a new wage-earning working class in particular industrial regions, notably the Ruhr in northwest Germany, Saxony in the east of Germany, and cities like Berlin and Hamburg. And again, the growth of the industrial working class is unmistakable as the dominant social trend in mid to late 19th century Germany. And the explosive growth of working class communities, or communities that are demographically dominated by workers. So Bochum in the Ruhr grew from, I won't give you too many statistics, but just a few illustrations. Bochum grew from 1,600 in 1800, it was practically a village at the start of the 19th century, to 155,000 people in 1913. A lot of that's driven by the mining industry. Essen grew from a town of about 3,500 at the start of the 19th century to over 300,000 by 1913. Over 10% of people who lived in Essen worked for the Krupp Works, the massive armaments works. Berlin went from being, and Tina mentioned I'm sort of here at the moment where they've got that ghastly fake Schloss, which I cannot stand, trying to reconstruct the 19th century here. Berlin was a sandy backwater in the early 19th century. It was a garrison town, seat of the Prussian government. Most of the Prussian kings preferred to live in Potsdam anyway. Berlin was really out of the way of the action in the rest of the German states, quite behind in most ways. But by the mid-19th century, it's a dynamic centre of industrial development. It's a centre of the new machine building industry by even the 1840s, the electrical industry later in the 19th century. And the population of Berlin is growing at a staggering rate once the Industrial Revolution kicks in. It's growing by around 100,000 a decade by the 1860s and 70s. The statisticians were struggling to keep up as new working class suburbs were dragged out of the ground on the city's northern and eastern outskirts. And these vast blocks of tenement buildings, bits of which you can still see today, called rental barracks, were constructed in the last third of the 19th century to house Berlin's rapidly growing working class population. So you're getting kind of dominant demographic concentrations of and new industrial manual working class in new urban centres and industrial regions, which promote the growth of distinct working class milieus with a very dominantly working class profile. Excuse me. Out of practice at talking too much. There's consensus among social historians, whether these are of a Weberian orientation or Marxist, that by the mid-1870s in Germany, everyone can see that there's a distinct wage-earning working class, which, more importantly, is increasingly aware of itself as a working class. People are breaking away from the older craft guild orientation and seeing themselves as part of a new working class and as having much in common with people from other trades and backgrounds who are also wage-earning workers. So, but by the 1870s, there is a kind of increasingly self-conscious working class, and by 1910, there are 2 to 3 generations of working class people who've grown up conscious of this identity. And it's quite self-evident, people don't really try to deny it, that at the time, that Imperial Germany was profoundly divided along class lines. Class location was a very strong and fundamental determinant of the life chances and experiences of Germans. At the most basic level of health and life expectancy, Imperial Germany is clearly highly unequal. Just the material life chances are sort of massively unequal. In terms of education, most Germans' schooling finished with the end of elementary school, and at the opposite end of the educational spectrum, only a very few Germans of working class background made it into the country's universities. There is near universal literacy in the German states by the 1840s, 1850s, and that's important. But educational, occupational, health, life expectancy, along with gender, class is the most important structural determinant of Germans' life chances in the 19th century, and everyone knows it. So the first point is, I guess, you've got that material base for a vibrant working class movement, in that you've got the quite rapid development of an industrial working class that is increasingly demographically dominant in a range of industrial regions and cities across Germany. Then you've got the early break with liberalism. And again, I always find it fascinating that this happens in Germany nearly 30 years before the split of the Independent Labour Party from the Liberals in the UK. The German working class movement, the German Social Democrats, break with liberalism quite early compared with other comparable labour movements. In 1863, you've got the first distinct working class political party founded in Leipzig and placed under the leadership of this sort of colourful character, Ferdinand Lassalle. Although the workers, the German Workers, the General German Workers Association, the ADAV, also built on older foundations such as the Workers' Brotherhood that organised democratic workers' groups during the 1848-49 revolution. There was also the League of Communists, of course, in 1848 in the Rhineland, but the Workers' Brotherhood probably had sort of greater territorial coverage. And there are sort of lines of continuity from both of these revolutionary organizations in 1848-49 to the early Social Democrats. Lassalle's party was, as you know, you've heard about this with the Gotha program, was followed by the foundation of the Social Democratic Workers' Party in Eisenach by Bebel and Liebknecht, who'd previously worked in collaboration with Saxon and Southern German bourgeois and anti-Prussian political groupings. But in 1869, Bebel and Liebknecht break with the bourgeois liberals and bourgeois Democrats that they'd previously been collaborating with. So again, I find it quite notable that you have this clean break between a proletarian and explicitly socialist and democratic political party, for a while two political parties, and bourgeois liberalism about a generation before this happens in Britain, despite Britain starting much earlier with industrialization. So why do you get this very early emancipation from liberal tutelage? One is that German liberalism is undergoing a series of political crises in the 1860s. The 1848-49 revolutions had made it clear that in Germany that a commitment to democracy as opposed to liberal constitutional government in which monarchical power remained intact was shared by only a marginal minority of the German middle classes. So for a German bourgeois politician to be described as a Democrat in 1848-49 means they're basically a Jacobin, a red revolutionary, as opposed to, you know, moderate parliamentary liberals who just want monarchs to consult more and they want business people to have more of a say in trade and tax policies. I always have to explain to my university students that in the 19th century, being a Democrat and being a liberal were not the same thing. They were very distinct ideologies. And what the 1848-49 revolutions quite made very clear to the emerging working class left was that they didn't have very many allies when it came to democracy in the middle classes. So there was that legacy. There were the political and constitutional crises of the 1860s, which people used to learn about in high school. I'm not sure this is still taught much in high schools, but there were repeated splits and compromises of the German liberals confronted with Bismarck's process of, you know, unifying Germany by violence from above. Only a minority of German liberals showed themselves willing to prioritize parliamentary accountability of the executive over the goal of a strong unitary national state, which got majority support by German middle-class liberals. The national question further fractured the German middle classes, pitting the supporters of a Prussian-dominated empire over more federally inclined southern German liberals. So, you know, German liberals, in other words, in the 1860s are in a mess. They're deeply divided over the extent to which they should be trying to hold the monarchical governments to account through parliament, or whether they should just embrace having a strong national state as favourable to middle-class economic interests. These divisions over the national question and the role of Parliament in the new empire coincided in the later 1860s with major strikes. You know, the two sort of huge strikes which go for quite a long time. And if you leaf through the socialist newspapers of the time, like Der Volksstaat, edited by Liebknecht, every issue has a sort of tagline over the top saying, remember the workers of Krimichow and support the miners in Waldenburg. There was the big textile workers' strike in Krimichow in Saxony, the great region for the textile industry in Germany, and miners in Waldenburg in Lower Silesia. Now, what is happening with trade unions in the 1860s is that the first people who try to create them are actually left liberal politicians who think they need working class foot soldiers to try to drum up more support for left liberal politics. But the progressive liberals are kind of skewered when these strikes break out, because the longer the strikes went on, or when they came to an unsuccessful end, as they did, the clearer the conflict of interest between workers and their liberal political patrons became. And the Social Democrat press, both the ADAV and the Bebel-Liebknecht wing, are constantly emphasizing that, you can't really trust bourgeois politicians trying to lead trade unions, because they're best friends with the industrialists, if they're not actually industrialists themselves. And in the last few days, I've been reading accounts of public meetings held for workers in Berlin or elsewhere in, say, the beginning of 1870, when progressive liberal politicians on the left of liberalism are holding public meetings for workers, and then finding themselves outnumbered by adherents of social democracy who rejected the liberals' opposition to the concept of class conflict. So, social democrats are rocking up to these progressive liberals' meetings and saying, well, you say you're on the workers' side, but you don't agree with class conflict. How does that, as a concept, how does that work? So you've got a number of things that come together in the 1860s. The internal weaknesses and splits of German liberalism means they're not very successful at exercising hegemony at the class beneath them, let alone over any other parts of German society. And the rise of significant strike movements of workers really sort of exposes the weaknesses of liberal attempts to lead a trade union movement. And even though the Lassalleans in theory are anti-trade unions, in practice they support these strikes, as do the Eisenacher wing. So I think the early emancipation of the working class movement from liberal tutelage in Germany was crucial. By the 1860s and 70s, workers were starting to view liberal or religious working class educational associations, of which there are many. It's a sort of philanthropic attempt to let's help the workers, gain some self-improvement. By the 1860s, 70s, workers are increasingly regarding these liberal or religious-led workers' groups as an attempt to distract them from political organisation. They resented the second-class status they experienced in liberal political organisations, like the National Association, the main supporter of German nationalism. And they quickly came to distrust trade unions run by left liberals, well-meaning or otherwise, as failing to truly represent their class interests. So the German working class movement thus learned to walk on its own feet at a very early age. Third broad point is the influence of the repressive German state. And repressive, but still to some extent bound by its own concept of the rule of law. Excuse me. So there are some paradoxes of imperial Germany. In 1871, most men over 25 had the vote, wider franchise than in Britain after the Second Reform Act. So a higher proportion of men over 25 had the vote. Mind you, you have to remember that if you're a worker, you've been in the workforce since 14 at the latest. So you're economically active and earning an income for 10, 12 years before you get to vote. But this advanced suffrage for the 1870s was hedged around by limits on parliamentary power, by restrictions on national political party organisation. So in theory, the German Social Democrats are banned from, and anyone is banned from forming a truly national party. Of course, they get around this, but in theory, you have nearly 400 electoral associations who just happen to hold congresses together once a year. There were regressive franchise laws at state and local level. And interestingly, as Social Democrats start to get a mass base of support in places like Saxony and Hamburg and others, and Lübeck and other places, you have frantic rewriting of electoral laws. This happens twice in Saxony to try and stop the Social Democrats getting a majority at the state or local level. Prussia always had a very regressive income-based franchise, which minimizes working class representation in the state of Prussia. So, if it looks like the Social Democrats are getting too close to political power, the elites collude to, and liberal parties and the anti-Semites and everyone else collude to rewrite the electoral laws and gerrymander the boundaries to keep the socialists out. But elections were still an opportunity to organise and make a show of strength for social democracy, and they make full use of those. Police harassment is evident quite early in the organised labour movement's history, especially in Prussia in the early 1870s, as the two social democratic parties start to grow in strength. They're both harassed equally by the Prussian state. And this is one of the factors driving the merger of the two parties, among others. Then there was the anti-socialist law, which I don't think you can underestimate the extent to which this shapes the party and its consciousness. And it's a kind of complex effect. On the one hand, the anti-socialist law radicalizes the party. On the other hand, they drive out the anarchists because they're too unaccountable. And it also leads to a peculiar increase in authority of the parliamentary caucus, because the parliamentary caucus is the only part of the party that can operate legally during the banning of the party and its publications. But the anti-socialist law dramatically fails to stop the growth of the party, when the Social Democrats get 1.4 million votes in the 1890 elections, this kind of it's the death knell for Bismarck's chancellorship, because he's clearly failed to stop the growth of the Social Democrats. Not that anyone else knew how to do that. And the anti-socialist law is abandoned in 1890 because people are still voting for the party, even though it's illegal and its newspapers are banned. This provides the party with a tradition of heroic years of struggle. Many of the party leaders serve jail sentences. Someone like Wilhelm Liebknecht serves at least half a dozen jail sentences, including when he's quite elderly already. Other party leaders go into exile. The party learns how to organize illegally and underground, smuggling newspapers into the country and circulating them, taking part in other illegal and underground activity through camouflaged associations. The word legal is struck out of the Gotha program once a party is banned, because if you were to take it literally, then the party would have to cease to exist if it couldn't act illegally. And so there is this process of radicalization on the one hand, at the same time as some of the party, the anarchists on the fringe of the party and the pushed out of the party. Class justice is a reality in Imperial Germany. There's a wide range of laws open to political misuse or even designed to be politically misused. There's the law against insulting the monarchy. And in Imperial Germany, you could be jailed for insulting any one of 22 monarchs, depending on what state you're in. You could, of course, insult the Kaiser, the Emperor, or King of Prussia, or you could insult your own king. And hundreds of people are being jailed a year for periods of 3 to 6 months for insulting the monarchy, usually in the social democratic press or sometimes in meetings. You could be jailed for insulting religion or the army. Even after the end of the anti-socialist law in the 1890s, hundreds of social democrats are imprisoned every year on a range of offences. If you were the editor of a party paper in the 1890s, a 3 to 6 month prison term was a regular occupational hazard, and many editors served multiple jail sentences. On the other hand, this isn't the Nazi dictatorship. The state still has to follow its own laws. If accused social democrats can provide medical evidence, then their trials can be deferred. On one of Rosa Luxemburg's trials, they even the prosecution even allows her to take a break in Switzerland for her health, and then she came back. And of course, if it had been Nazi Germany, she wouldn't have come back. So class justice was a reality, but you still had sort of legal footholds that social democrats could take advantage of. And as I mentioned, during the anti-socialist law, electoral campaigning and parliamentary activity were still permitted, at least running for election and standing for parliament, if you were a social democrat, was still permitted. And this probably, again, leads to perhaps an increased weight on parliamentary activity as a paradoxical outcome of the anti-socialist law. But again, this is very much a class state, and everyone can see it is. Social democrats are totally banned from public sector employment and universities. There's a notorious case where an unsalaried, untenured lecturer in physics in Berlin loses his job because he was a moderate reformist social democrat, a guy called Leo Ahrens. You couldn't sort of work in the large public sector if you were a known social democrat. The authorities vet army recruits to keep an eye on known socialist agitators, making sure they're not posted anywhere where they might cause trouble. So there is, a strong class-oriented state which is repressive. And again, everybody is well aware of this. It's well known that the army is constantly in a state of preparedness to take action against strikers or potential socialist unrest. And Kaiser Wilhelm II is notorious for making inflammatory comments about the need to suppress socialist unrest with force. And if the Kaiser gets a report about a strike on the railways, for example, he writes things in the margin like, well, you must use force against these terrible people and use live ammunition. So the Imperial German state and the Prussian state are sort of notoriously have this notoriously repressive attitude towards the labor movement. And the big strikes in 1905 and 1912 in the Ruhr, you can see increasing escalation of military force being deployed against large-scale strikes, as well as increasing private sector violence, which Amerigo Caruso in Bonn has done some interesting work on. Mining companies hiring their own Pinkerton-type private security people, as well as calling in the army. So you have this very, very sort of clear sense of opposition to an anti-democratic and repressive state. At the same time, the state's discrimination against workers and against social democrats helps to create these compact socio-cultural milieus with a very strong sense of identity. And one of the ways in which the social democrats react to this repression is by the creation of an alternative culture, if you like. So workers who are discriminated against in bourgeois society and by the German state create their own public sphere, if you like, their own spheres for spending their leisure time. Social Democrat Party pubs become key places for sociability as well as for political organization. So, workers would sit there and do what they normally did in pubs, drink beer, play games with dice and read the newspapers. But they're reading Social Democrat newspapers and often talking about what's in them. And the pubs will be used for brunch Tuesdays. The Social Democratic Party creates a whole sort of sphere of leisure organizations, sporting and cultural associations, as well as regular festivals, including family festivals, which meant that workers could really spend their whole lives within the sort of framework of socialist organized activity. So once cycling became popular, with cheaper bicycles becoming available at the turn of the century, you had the Workers' Cyclist Association, which becomes very useful during election times because it then becomes the Red Cavalry, and they go around and use it to distribute election flyers and so forth. You've got workers' libraries, workers' theatre groups, workers' glee clubs, singing organisations, chess and Esperanto clubs for socialists. You name it. It's everything's being done within the framework of the socialist labour movement, and so one of the things that is really striking about Imperial Germany, and by the way, the same thing happens to some extent with Catholics when there's a period of time in which they're being discriminated against. They form their own sort of organizational world, including Catholic trade unions, which are never as big as the Social Democrat trade unions, but do manage to capture some proportion of the Catholic working class. You get this incredible segmentation of German society with really deep divisions between the Social Democrat world, which is working class and democratic and socialist, the Catholic world, and the Protestant nationalist pro-monarchy world. Quite deep divisions of camps, which to some extent get shaken up by the Nazi regime and the defeat in 1945, but only really disappear with deindustrialization in the post-war period. And then you've got the importance of socialist ideology. And I won't try and go over the same ground that you had with the Gotha program, but there used to be, it's quite interesting reading the older Cold War period literature, that right-wing German Social Democrats in West Germany and the official version of East German history of the labor movement, interestingly, both agreed that that the Lasallians were the ancestors of right-wing Social Democrats, and Bebel and Liebknecht were good Marxists and the ancestors of the Communist Party and East Germany. And so Lassalle is celebrated in West Germany by right-wing Social Democrats, and the Bebel-Liebknecht wing were seen as the sound Marxists. This was a bit of a fairy story on both sides, because both sides' socialist theory was quite eclectic, and there's lots of evidence for that, until the period of illegality. Engels' work with the anti-Düring in trying to get rid of some of the eclectic ideas that were being spread around the labour movement in the 1870s, and the work of the party press during the years of illegality in spreading Marxian thought. And interestingly, both the Lasallians and the Eisenachers in the 1860s thought there was a lot of prestige to be gained by identifying themselves with the first Workers' International, and so they're both quite keen to be seen to be signing up to the first International, and there's even some competition between them to do that. But the 12 years of illegality sees the new Erfurt program being hammered out as a kind of mature statement of Marxist revolutionary theory. And from what I've been saying about Germany's social and political structure, I think it's not hard to see that in the 1890s for German workers, Marxism makes obvious sense as an explanation of the class divisions and inequalities in imperial German society. And in my book a few years ago, I argued that Marx's ideas were more thoroughly disseminated through print media and in-person meetings than many previous writers have allowed for. When you're talking about the media in this period, you're talking about sort of face-to-face meetings, usually held in indoor venues like beer halls or pubs, and the print media. I can't stress enough the importance to this form of the labour movement, this quite ideologically aware labour movement, that Germany had near universal literacy, and the backbone of the organised labour movement were relatively skilled workers, sometimes with a craft background, and these were examples of Bertolt Brecht's classic figure, the worker who reads, So, the radical labour movements are a product of a literate urban industrial working class and workers who spend at least part of their leisure time reading reading literature that helps to explain their situation and the situation of other workers. And we know they're not sitting down with the book version of Capital Volume 1. We know very few people did acquire that and read it, and it was expensive for ordinary workers. But there's huge dissemination, I've tried to argue, of Marxian ideas through the sort of Karl Kautsky's Reader's Digest version that comes out in 1889 in time for the Erfurt program. There are pamphlets of key publications like the Communist Manifesto, which goes through many thousands of editions, and the party press is full of short excerpts from texts from Marx and Engels. And people talk about it in mass meetings. It's not on the agenda for every mass meeting or local branch meeting, but Marxian ideas keep coming round in these meetings. So I've argued that you can't just look at how many people are borrowing capital from libraries or buying it, and we know it took a long time to sell most of its first edition of 500 copies. But the ideas are being disseminated, and they're being disseminated along with secular ideas, pro-science ideas, and there's a kind of radical socialist ecosystem of ideas being promoted through pamphlet literature and the press. I think it's hard to imagine these kinds of ideas with a different kind of media environment than the evolution of cheap newsprint, which enabled the sort of mass dissemination of these ideas. But still, people still had to spend time to sit down and read the stuff. And once people became acquainted with Marxian ideas, as I've suggested, they make obvious sense in understanding imperial Germany. Why is bread getting more expensive? Well, it's because of the political power of the large landowners who are able to leverage their political power to further their own economic interests and vice versa. So you have indirect taxes on goods of ordinary people's consumption rather than heavier taxes on the rich, and import duties on grain and other foodstuffs that make bread and meat more expensive for workers, and they need to protect Germany's big landowning interests. And the nexus between the class-based political power system and economic inequalities becomes very clear to workers. It's a very successful topic for social democratic agitation. So they have coordinated mass meetings all over the country on, why is, bread so expensive? And again, it's because of the Junkers taking advantage of their political power to look after their own material interests. So again and again, for German workers, reading the Social Democrat press, going to their meetings, reading their pamphlets, Marxist explanations of how the class state was operating made obvious sense. The Erfurt program's often been criticised because the short-term demands and the longer-term revolutionary perspective, it's often argued, contained a tension that later manifested itself in the split between revisionists and reformists and the more Marxist left and centre of the party. And the Marxist left and centre also increasingly diverge after 1910. But I would also want to emphasise the other side of the story, which is the fact that the party was able to both speak to workers' immediate concerns, like the price of bread and meat, and beer for that matter. It spoke to workers' immediate concerns, the terrible state of workers' housing, the health problems that workers faced in their poor housing. But it also offered a transformative vision of a better society. And this is where sort of Marxism both offers a sort of cogent material explanation for the current economic situation and plight of workers, but it also offered a transformative vision of a better society in which workers would be free from oppression. And these two sides, I think, were both crucial for the strength of the Social Democratic Party in its classic period. Excuse me for finishing on a cough, but I think I've gone through my 40 minutes. Over to Tina.
Thank you very much, comrade. Sorry to hear you're coughing. I think you've been spending too much time in the archives with books and getting a lot of dust in your lungs. So thank you for powering through the brilliant presentation. Comrades, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, please click raise hand and we can make you into panelists. To get the ball rolling, I mean, it was really interesting to hear about how the Sozialistengesetze, the banning of the party actually helped to push it together, to push comrades together, to get them to organize and to start building what became one of the key aspects, I think, of the SPD is the state within a state, isn't it? We build our own structures in the here and now, a counter structures to the bourgeois state, and we, that's how we build up our socialism almost, in the here and now within capitalism. And interesting as well that you say that the Erfurt program was really crucial in this. For bringing the working class together, but because that was the first program, as I understand it, that was a minimum maximum structure. So you say yes, what affects me today, but also we have to have a vision where we're going. We have to know. We're not just fighting for higher wages. We're not just fighting against, the monarchy. We're also fighting for socialism, and we're explaining what socialism is. And that's, I believe, then and could be deeply inspiring for people. They need to have a vision, and it's not, we're seeing a lot of, in the defeat of the Corbyn movement in particular, a lot of organizations who are just sticking to the minimum bit. That's what we all against, etc. But they're getting nowhere. And I think part of this getting nowhere is that you're not inspiring people, and especially in the aftermath of the Soviet Union, especially with the existence of a lot of sects, etc., who organize in a very undemocratic way. We need to say that's not what we are trying to do. We're trying to do something entirely different. And going back to the Marxism of the SPD is a much better a way to go back, and it's much more necessary today, considering that climate catastrophe, etc., war, Third World War are looking like a realistic possibility, and that the working class is now actually for the first time the majority worldwide. So we're actually objectively we're in a much better position than the comrades were then, but subjectively I think worldwide we're in still a dire position at the moment, and things seem to be going more to the right. I thought it was quite interesting when you're talking about this, the ban and how it actually helped to cohere the SPD is. The AfD in Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, has become the big winner of the recent elections, and talk of banning it and talk of banning right-wing organizations is usually the sort of the first thing that people say. We have to ban them, and then that'll shut them up. In your view, Andrew, do you think that would be perhaps? I mean, it's a different organization, but would that perhaps actually achieve possibly the opposite? Could that have that could have an impact like a ban had on the SPD? Or it could make it into martyrs. It could actually help them grow.
Thanks, Tina. I mean, we were talking beforehand about the fact that the Linke, which looked like it was not going to make it, end of last year, we didn't expect the Linke would be in the next Bundestag, and then they surged to 8.8%, and the AfD, I think, well, it's terrible that the AfD is on nearly 21%, and we've just had the inauguration of the new Bundestag. And it reminds me of September 1930, where you see the photo of over 100 Nazis on the right of the chamber in September 1930. That was their breakthrough election, when they go from having about 24 people in the Reichstag to over 100. And now you've got 152 AfD people. But the Linke was much more successful than people expected. And I think it was because they went out and they talked to people about the economy. And all the other parties were trying to join the AfD talking about migration, but the Linke was talking about economics. And interestingly, if you dig into the opinion polls, most people say they're more concerned about their economic situation than about foreigners in Germany. And I think, for a left-wing party to go out and say, we're going to talk about the economic topics that, really concern people. I'm not going to get into the competition about who's got the most anti-foreigner policies. I think the way to combat the AFD is not by trying to use the state security organs against them, because the state security organs are full of sympathisers for the AFD anyway. So these are not necessarily the people you want to have doing this. But the best way to combat the AFD is to get out and talk about the things that working people are concerned about, the economic situation, and don't engage with the anti-foreigner competition.
Yeah. And they also, of course, they did. I mean, they have a wishy-washy position on Palestine, but they did eventually settle on a position of no arms to Ukraine and Israel. I think that helped it as well. One more question before I bring in people from the floor. You mentioned the difference, and that's quite interesting. Britain was industrialized earlier than Germany, and you had a working class earlier than Germany, but it took them much longer to organize independently. There's a totally different relationships between the unions and the Labour Party, and the unions and the Social Democratic Party. I mean, in Britain, it's the unions that set up the Labour Party, and it's still reflected in 50% at conference is the union vote, usually to the right. They are, play a massive role on the leadership of the Labour Party, and are generally, on the conservative side and holding things back. How was the union relationship to the SPD? You mentioned some issues, but organizationally, in the structure of the SPD, what role did the unions play?
So the Labour Party, and of course you've got some areas of radicalism in the union movement, but that comes more from the rank and file than the leadership. But the so-called free trade unions are aligned with the Social Democrats, but with the 1906 Mannheim Conference, they managed to get their own autonomy recognized, so that they're not subject to party direction. But the unions have it both ways, in a sense that you still have union leaders who are party members getting onto the Social Democrats party executive and playing an influential role in party congresses in the decade before the First World War. So they do sort of managed to establish this concept of autonomy, if not party political neutrality, because the free trade unions are still led by SPD members and are closely aligned with them. But so they are a bit of they do work against radical arguments on, say, the mass strike and the political uses of industrial action. So they do form a bit of a counterweight to the more radical wing of the party, and they have this, as I said, position of having it both ways, that they're both autonomous from the party, but they also still have a weight within the party.
That's interesting. Thank you. It did remind, when you were talking about just a quick one on this the state repression, that helped to form the party. I mean, we're getting there, aren't we? We're getting to a situation where you're being in Germany as well as in Britain. I'm not sure how bad it is in Australia, but particularly around Palestine, it's the whole narrative around, criticizing Israel is now anti-Semitic, etc. And you go to prison for racism. That's happening in Germany. It's happening in Britain, where protests more generally are being illegalized, etc. I can't see at the moment that it's helping us build our own forces, but it's not automatic, isn't it? It has to be linked to some reawakening of working class power. But there's also when you mentioned Rosa Luxemburg, reminded of the film by Margarete von Trott, Rosa Luxemburg, which shows her in prison, and it looks like a holiday camp. I mean, she's got her flowers there. She can have visitors. They're walking around. She's got it doesn't look too bad. She's loads of books, etc. That's not, of course, how prison is today for people. So, we don't want to think, there's no automatic relation between, oh, maybe when we get repressed more, then working class rebellion will start again. It's a totally different situation today. Okay, we're bringing in some comrades from the floor now. Ian first. Hi.
Thank you, Andrew. It's fascinating. I'm really interested in the whole thing. I just wanted to ask about the fact that Lenin was famously so shocked he had to take time off and couldn't believe that the Social Democrats had voted for war credits and so on. To what extent was the kind of revisionism of Bernstein widespread and popular throughout the German Social Democratic Party at the time? And so that's one thing. I mean, because it always wondered to what extent that Lenin had overestimated the radicalism of the SPD. Certainly when you look at the British Labour Party, which has never had a kind of a radical tradition really, it's never had a particularly strong left or anything like that. The other thing I wanted to ask about was you've actually already answered the question largely, which is how the German SPD managed to have such a good development of theoretical perspectives, but that notwithstanding that, it didn't seem to save them, as it were, from the disastrous mistake of August 1914. That's it.
Thanks, Ian. It's a bad academic habit to sort of cite yourself, but I did actually publish a paper which came out at the end of last year in the German Historical Institute bulletin from Washington, D.C., which you can Google and it's free online, called, I think, Rethinking the Anti-War Protests of July 1914. And it's not very well known that between 500,000 and maybe 750,000 supporters of the German Social Democrats in the last week of July protest against the threat of war. And not far from where I'm sitting now, you had people marching up and down the Unter den Linden, being boxed in by police, singing the Internationale on the 28th of July 1914. But once the state mobilized for war, then the commanding general of the Army Corps could basically bang up anyone who showed any resistance whatsoever, and everyone is well aware of this. So mobilization kind of has this chilling effect. The other thing is the government does very skillfully, much more skillfully than the Blair government's trying to sell the war on Iraq, is it presents a war as a defensive war against Tsarist Russia. And for European socialists, the only government that's more reactionary and appalling in Europe than Germany or maybe Austria is Tsarist Russia. And the German government's very successful at manipulating the media and the communications about the diplomatic goings on to make it look like, oh, the Russians are now marching across our eastern border. We need to have a defensive mobilization because the Russians have already mobilized. So the whole degree of, as a combination of things, I think you do have anti-war protests sort of right down to the day before mobilization. And some people argue it's a sham, but still, you have over 500,000 people, maybe 750,000 people going on the streets to protest against the war, which doesn't happen on the same scale in any other country. I mean, there are smaller protests in France, there are smaller protests in Britain, but the German ones are massive. But as soon as you declare mobilization, the army can lock anyone up, and the police are then occupying every Social Democrat newspaper office to censor the papers before they're printed. So I think certainly the reformist elements become much stronger between 1905 and 1914, and Kautsky is writing some of his most radical stuff with the road to power, and the party executive get very anxious about this and think this is looking too militant and might cause problems. So I think certainly the party executive, party leadership, with the spread of reformism, revisionism, is becoming more conservative. And once Babel dies in 913, that great sort of popular tribune of the, popular revolutionary tribune who had such a strong hold over the party for a long time, he's gone by 1914. And as to how radical the party was, it depends on where you are. In Berlin, I've read lots of police accounts of public meetings where, if you get revisionists who are trying to justify colonialism and imperialism, the majority of the meetings are really worked up against them, and there's a lot of rank and file pushback against revisionist members of parliament in radical centres like Berlin. South Germany, Southwest Germany, the rank and file tend to be much less militant. And I, came across this newspaper article. I think it's somewhere in Bavaria, where there's a social democrat from Saxon who's going to the Bavarian party meeting, and Saxony was also had a very large radical social democrat movement, and the Social Democrats won 22 out of 23 Reichstag seats in Saxony in 1903. And this is also the state where they're rewriting the electoral laws twice to keep the socialists out. And there's a Saxon Social Democrat in Bavaria, and he's saying, "Why aren't you more anti the monarchy, and why aren't you more anti the police?" And they go, "Well, our police are okay. They're not too bad, and they're not very well paid." And there were different regional cultures, and southern German and more rural social democrat areas were much less militant than Saxony, Berlin, Bremen, Hamburg, the Ruhr, etc. So there were regional differences, and the non-radical areas sort of helped with the trade union wing to sort of pull the party a bit to the right. So it's a really mixed story. You've got both potentials in the party right down to 1914 before the split. Sorry if that's been rambling, but you raised a lot of points.
It's important, isn't it, for us today as well, because we want to build a working class party, as big as possible. But there are some issues that, we might have to split over, and that war, imperialism, is certainly an issue that perhaps the SPD should have split earlier, and perhaps things could have gone a bit differently if there had been an opposition to this support of imperialism. Do you think there was a possibility of that? An earlier split could have changed history?
Me is that the idea of working class unity is really important to a lot of people in this period, and I think it's not just organizational fetishism. You want to keep the party structure and its assets intact. I think it was also quite ingrained in the working class movement in Germany that if the workers are divided and you've got, say, a big strike, if you're divided, you'll lose in a big strike there. So I think that concept of unity is. And even though, the people on the left of the party in August 1914 are in despair, and a lot of them vote internally in the internal caucus meeting against the war credits, but then they all go along with the actual vote, including Karl Liebknecht. But then in December, the government come round for the next round of war credits, and that's when Liebknecht breaks ranks with the party. But it was really hard even for Karl Liebknecht in August 1914 to break with the united working class. Although reading what some of the right-wingers in the party are saying in August 1914, if they had lost the vote in the party room for the war credits, the right would have split. much sooner than the left did, as it turned out. So, that I think that that value of having a united working class movement was something that was really hard for everyone to break with.
Thank you. Anne.
Hi, yeah, thanks very much, Andrew. Okay, so there's so much in what you've said, and I'm just trying to think about the main issues I want to ask you about. So, okay, so the first thing is something actually I haven't really considered before, but I live here in Ireland, and I know that within the Irish movement before, well, we'll say maybe at the very early part of the 20th century, the likes of James Connolly and some others would have been influenced by the SPD. But I'm wondering, what about the question of Ireland as a colonial question? Was that ever an issue in the SPD? I mean, I haven't unfortunately read your book, but I've read Mike Tabor's book on the resolutions of the Second International and the debates in the Second International, which I found really interesting, and it gave me a flavour of what the SPD was like because of how it operated in the international. And there certainly are plenty of discussions around colonialism in that, but I think that my understanding was that they were mostly about Africa, maybe parts of the Middle East, because they were pushing back against the what was it, the basically the grab for Africa, and on that, how much would you say that workers in general were influenced by colonialism, continue to be influenced by colonialism? And then the second question is, so the policy of the Second International, as far as I can remember, was basically in case of war, that you should refuse to sign up to the war effort, but that you should defend your own country, that as in the manner of using a popular militia. So my question about that was there an organized popular militia in Germany? Did the SPD organize one? And I suppose the bigger question, and one you don't really have to answer, is whether that question, I suppose, and a certain ambiguity on that issue, was partially behind the voting for war credits, i.e. the fact that it was agreed that if you were under attack, that a popular militia would defend your country from attack only as a defensive action, not as an aggressor. Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Anne. And nice to see you again. I think you were at Ben's conference online last year, so nice to see you again.
Yeah.
So I think 3 points I'll take in reverse order. So popular militia instead of a standing army is Social Democrats' party program. Do they do anything to put into practice apart from publishing pamphlets about this would be a good idea? No, probably because as soon as workers started drilling with weapons, the authorities would have jumped in. I mean, the biggest failure of the SPD, one of the biggest failures of the SPD, was that in November 1918, they don't form a popular militia and do deals with the reactionary Imperial Army, which then starts killing workers. So, I mean, they should have formed one when they had the chance in November 1918, which the Austrian socialists actually do in Vienna. But so the Social Democrats support a popular militia in theory, but don't do anything about it in practice, not even in November 1918. There was this sort of, clause that, they endorse national defense, but not a war of aggression. And Robert Michels, when he was an active in the Social Democratic Party, and if you've seen my book about him, you know I don't like him. But he had the sense to point out, well, how can you tell if it's a war of defence just because the government tells you it's a war of defence? And as I said, they're very skilled at the government in 1914. German government is very skilled at saying, "Oh, look, the Russians are mobilising. We haven't mobilised yet. We have to mobilise to stop the Russians, swarming across the border with East Prussia." They're very skilled at presenting this as a defensive war, and the government propagandists can even quote Marx and Engels from 1848, saying that no revolution will be successful until we bring down Tsarism. On Ireland, I haven't come across much on Ireland, but certainly colonialism. The majority of the party are very anti-colonialist, and the main episode that gets a lot of publicity in Germany is, of course, the genocidal war in Southwest Africa, which the Social Democrat press quite wholeheartedly oppose, and it is very critical of the way that war's waged. It's critical of German colonies because they're seen as money drains. Unlike the British Empire, they don't seem to be making a profit out of the German Empire, because the German Empire gets the leftover bits after the British and French have got the more attractive real estate. And again, I've read accounts of where sort of right-wing revisionist Social Democrat theorists and members of the Reichstag have tried to defend colonialism in public meetings in Berlin. They get howled down, and voted. The meeting votes to disagree with their views and disendorse their views on colonialism. So there's been a lot written about how the revisionist right of the SPD was sympathetic to colonialism, but that's really a minority position. And one of the main reasons is that German workers think that they're paying for the colonies just for the banking and other finance interests and the naval interests, but they're another drain on the pockets of the working class as far as they can see. But I'll keep an eye out for Ireland. I haven't seen a lot in the Social Democrat press on Ireland.
Thank you. Ant.
Hi, Tina. Can you hear?
Yep. Right.
Hiya. Okay. Yeah, great talk. Lots of information. Definitely. Deep knowledge. Okay. Many questions involved as regards the SPD. I think all the sort of like the main questions of Marxism are involved. But I don't want to restrict myself to this simple question. But I will pose a question at the beginning. Yes. And my question is, do we need today? Well, what can I call it? A neo-Kautskyite party, a version of the SPD. Do we need something of a similar nature, or which my position, which I'm going to say that I support? No, we don't. The SPD what was possibly and only possibly good for its time, and that is being generous, I think. First of all, there seems to be this acceptance of this idea that we need a mass party. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by mass party. To me, obviously, the word mass needs to be defined. What do we mean by mass in the concept of a mass party? But I think if you're thinking in terms of a sort of like millions of members, I'm going to say again, I think you're mistaken. I don't think that's how a revolutionary party should operate today. I think that a revolutionary party should consist of committed revolutionaries. There's obviously there's a quantity and a quality argument, and no doubt about it. It's no use going into revolution with a party of a couple of dozen people, they're not going to get anywhere. But by the same token, a party which consists of millions of people who have got no revolutionary conceptions whatsoever, who just think that it's all about a better deal under capitalism, is not going anywhere either. And I think that the reality is that we live in different periods. The SPD mostly spanned the ascendant period of capitalism, and during the ascendant, and that's what led to the sort of like the right wing revisionism, whereby the idea that capitalism was going to collapse was seen as being, well, it's not collapsing. Capitalism's getting onwards and upwards. It's getting better and better and better and better, and that led them to believe that Marxism was obsolete, dogmatic, and that there was no collapse coming. There was no catastrophe coming. All there was a process of endless adaptation. Capitalism could adapt to the situation, and the working class could get an ever better deal. And that was seen as being, the real business of the party, getting an ever better deal for the working class. It wasn't, for the people who embraced that idea, for the people who took on board this revisionist idea, then the idea of revolution and a revolutionary party, is irrelevant. You don't need a revolutionary party. But I'm saying that today we don't live in the ascendant period of capitalism at all. We live in the we live in the foothills of World War III. We live in the crisis of capitalism, whereby, okay, maybe certain gains can be won, maybe certain battles can be won, but the outlook for the working class, internationally, the outlook for the working class is simply expect ever worse. That's the reality of the capitalist condition that we face today. And I'm going to say that in that situation, it's not a question of onwards and upwards and things can only get better. It's not a question of paying lip service to revolution. Revolution is now the only way out. I'm going to say, even Rosa Luxemburg, and I'm a big fan of Rosa Luxemburg, and I'm going to base much of my arguments around Rosa Luxemburg. Even she failed to see that there was a need for a real revolutionary party, and she, one of her sayings was, better the worst working class party than none at all. And as a result, there was no communist party formed in Germany until almost, it's sort of like a month before the January uprising. It was a complete mess. So yeah, I know Tina's wanting me to finish, so I'm going to finish. So yeah, I'm going to pose the question again. Do we need to replicate the SPD? Do we need a neo-Kautskyite party, or do we need something which can actually make a revolution? Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully that was okay.
Thank you. I mean, is that a question that you can't even answer? I'm not sure if you're an active socialist, or perhaps the question could also be reformulated. Can you, is the circumstances still there that you can build a party on the mass working class level?
As a historian who also sees himself as of the left, I guess I see my brief for this gathering not as trying to lay down the political prescriptions which you all have been debating in your own groups for a long time, but to sort of take the historical case study of the Social Democrats, where there was a historical moment in Germany with a pretty authoritarian state where you had a party that, at least in theory, has a revolutionary Marxist program which gets 1 million workers behind it, and the party is that political arm of the working class with the Catholic minority who are much smaller than the Social Democrats, of course. But this is kind of a rare historical moment. You have a sort of political expression of the whole politically conscious working class on a mass level. And at least in theory has a Marxist program, and that they do get a revolution in 1918, but it's after the First World War has screwed everything up. I don't think you can underestimate what a catastrophe 1914 to 18 is, for the whole Second International. I read something that's quoted in a recent New Left review, but I've got the book at home. I've never actually noticed this passage in it before, where the late French historian Fernand Braudel said that in 1914, socialism is on the verge of triumph, and then the First World War destroys it all. And, this is quite an extraordinary statement, but, think about it. Before the First World War breaks out, the Germans look like they're 1-2 elections away from, a socialist majority, or at least making it impossible for the Imperial German state to function the way it was. And in November 1918, 22 monarchies in Germany collapse, and no one cries about it. No one lifts a finger to defend them. They just collapse and abdicate and run away. So there's a revolution, but again, it's terribly mucked up because of the war and the lack of insight and imagination of the majority Social Democrats leadership, who don't even try to get workers to defend themselves. So I guess what I'm trying to do is to make clear the historical circumstances under which the SPD got in this position, where it looked like it was within reach of power before the First World War stuffed it all up, and it was a sort of viable expression of a mass working class base. Now, the next, a working class party in the 21st century is not going to look like the SPD. You won't have people with big square beards and those images from the old Social Democrat posters, with their big hammers and axes, knocking down capitalism. It's not going to look like that. The Labour movement now is less blue collar. It's more, unions are less blue collar. They're more feminized. But we're all still wage earners, as far as I know. We're all still wage earners, and there's a potential solidarity among wage earners, which isn't going to be like we aren't going to look like German metal workers from the 1890s, but we're still all wage workers. So anyway, that's what I'm trying to do, is just clarify that historical moment, but you can draw your own conclusions from it.
Well, and I think what we've learned from the SPD, what the Bolsheviks certainly learned, is that you need majority revolution, isn't it? You can't have a putsch, you can't force your way into, socialism, etc. It has to be the active working class taking power, and for that you need a mass party, in my view, anyway. Mike, hi.
Thanks. Thank you, Andrew. Very interesting talk, as the previous one, which I heard some time ago. I think I've two things, one of which is addressed to you and the other is addressed to Ant. And the one which is addressed to you is that it seems to me that it's possible to overstate the singularity of the case of the SPD. And my reason for saying that is, well, partly because actually the technique of unifying the left, and as a result it creates a snowball effect, is not only true of the SPD. Unifying the left in terms of political action is not only true of the SPD, but also of the SFIO in France in the early 1900s, and much more recently the Brazilian Workers' Party. Okay, it winds up with it's just another player of the Brazilian political game. The Scottish Socialist Party on a smaller scale in Scotland, the unification opening up, the militant opening up to the other left groups allows the SSB to briefly take off dramatically. Rifondazione in Italy, again, they destroy it by going into government, but the potential is there. And pushing a bit further back, the phenomenon of the broad-based cultural parties is also true of the PCF and the PCI in the period before the point at which they go in for Eurocommunism and so on, and even on a smaller scale, the construction of the Great Labour Majority of 1945 was constructed by labour organisations up and down the UK pursuing SPD-oriented styled rank and file mobilisation techniques, including the goddamn Herbert Morrisons and these guys, people from the right in the London County Council and so on and so forth. So that's I think that I don't think that one can say that this is a unique product of the conditions of the Second Reich, either in terms of this is the first growth of the working class, because of course the first growth of the working class, it does create conditions for a mass party. Same is true of the Chinese Communist Party in the 1920s. Start with 50 people and you're into hundreds of thousands very quickly, because it's the moment of the working class crystallizing out of the peasantry. But that's not the sole truth of it, because it's also true that after the working class has crystallized out of the peasantry, you can have that development. And that's true of France, that's true of Britain in terms of the Labour Party. And that's true actually of the mass communist parties, because the mass communist parties were not mass. Well, the PCF was mass from the outside because it was the majority of the old SFIO, but the PCI was not mass from the outset. And second, in relation to Ant's argument, the problem in essence is that you can't, there are necessary stages. You don't leap from strike action, and this is the common delusion of the far left, that you leap from strike action to strike committees, from strike committees to workers' councils, from workers' councils to the challenge for power. But the evidence is overwhelmingly against that. Before you get the question of the challenge for power posed, the working class as a class needs to intervene at the level of high politics, needs to be thinking about the constitutional order, needs to be thinking about political intervention at the parliamentary level. This is actually, at the end of the day, this is just Marx's arguments against Bakunin in 1869 to 1871. And it's in that sense, it's equally Lenin's arguments against the economists in What Is to Be Done and the run up to the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. I know there's a sort of trot thing of against, quote, stagism, but there are actually necessary stages. Like the guys, Network Rail started reconstructing the Oxford railway station, and they are in deep shit because in order to actually get at the foundations of the railway bridge, which they need to reconstruct, they need to take the bridge off, which would mean shutting down the railway. But the underlying fact is you can't get at the base without taking off the superstructure in order to get at it. And in the same way, you can't get to the question of power without addressing mass politics at the level of high politics and political intervention. It doesn't work to just go to leap over. That's it. So that's that's sort of intervening against Ant, but it in a sense supports the point that the SPD is still relevant to us, in spite of the fact that the working class, well, the working class in China is pretty lots of bloody horny-handed sons of toil and daughters of toil, but the working class in the imperialist countries is much more white collar and so on, because a lot of production has been offshored. But nonetheless, it's still as Andrew said, it's still a working class. That's it.
Mike, you want to respond to that, Andrew, or shall we take some more?
Briefly, thanks, Mike. I think your comparative points are very well taken, and I probably spend too much time with the German Social Democrats, and they always thought they were the star pupils of the Second International, and you spend too much time with them, it rubs off. But the comparative points are very well taken, and keep thinking about the tragedy of whatever happened to Italian communism. I mean, where did it go? I mean, you've still got lineages active elsewhere. Talking about the Linke before in Germany, but very well taken points as always. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. We've got a couple of people with their hands up. Maybe we'll take them all together now. Not together, but one after the other. William first. Hi.
Yeah, I'm also from Ireland. I can. Now, my understanding is that the Second International, the last time we met, I think it might have been in Stuttgart, they took a decision that if there was going to be an imperialist war between two imperial industrial powers, Germany and Britain, that the working class were to stand down and call a general strike and refuse to fight that war. Now, both the Social Democratic parties in Germany and Britain reneged on that. And in Britain, Keir Hardie, who made his last speech in the House of Commons the day the war was declared, and a fantastic speech it is too, it should be reproduced and passed around, actually then went home and died within 2 months with a broken heart because he knew what was going to happen. Now in Ireland, we had the leadership of James Connolly, who was leading the working class in the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. There was a competition, there had been competition between him and other Social Democrats, a fellow called William Walker. William Walker was the vice chair of the Independent Labour Party in Britain, and he was a unionist from Belfast, and him and Connolly clashed completely because Connolly was not an imperialist of any description, and he hated the British Empire. Now, from my understanding of Rosa Luxemburg, which is limited, I think she had a social chauvinism is what they called this thing that we were to join your national army and fight for your country and all this, and then sort out your differences afterwards. Now, only 2 socialist movements in Europe honoured the agreement of not taking up arms, and that was Ireland under Connolly and Russia under Lenin. Now, Connolly actually organised and participated in a revolution against Britain in the middle of the imperialist war. He thought it was advantageous for to do so. Now, he was condemned by some people on the left, including Trotsky, but thankfully, a more intelligent and better man, Lenin, said what he'd done was the right thing.
Thanks, William. If it's okay with you, Andrew, I'll take a couple of others because we want to finish by 30. So Matthew next, please.
Yeah, once I've managed to unmute. There's a few things I think, very briefly, I think, I mean, the interesting thing about the SPD is, of course, first of all, obviously, it's geographical, political difference. I mean, it published something like 60 odd newspapers, which is quite extraordinary for any organisation, and obviously, and all of they tended to be of different varieties. I mean, some of the, obviously, you had areas of the left and areas of the right. And interested to know what the dynamic is, between the left areas and the right areas. The second question really then is in relation to the Catholic Church. I mean, here in Scotland, Western Scotland in particular, of course, the Labour Party is a Catholic organisation, always has been. Very strange, that obviously, I mean, due obviously the influence of Ireland, that of course the left has been largely Catholic. In Germany, it's a bit different. I think the Catholic Church gets extremely paranoid because of the influence of social democracy, and actually starts moving its own political position. Comes up with the notion of social justice, which of course is a fundamentally counter-revolutionary idea, in order to try and preserve its own ranks from the depredations of the dreadful socialists. I mean, interesting to see what the dynamic was between, in terms of the Catholic working class. I mean, how much of it, actually went over to social democracy. The other thing, of course, is that obviously the social democracy, the Second International, of course, was profoundly against being involved in government. I mean, obviously, the example of Mitterrand in France, they expelled him quite rightly for joining government. Which, of course, I mean, clearly, post First World War, they're all desperate to get into governments and administer, capitalism in whatever ways possible, and of course, suppress the left. But what is it? What would be, I'm presuming that there was some influence in terms of local government. Did the SPT get into local government, and what once it was elected into local government, which I presume it was in many areas, what did it do? Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Important question. Sachin, before I bring in Andrew then to sum up and answer some questions. And it's hundreds of newspapers, I think the SPD used to run, not just 60. Sachin, I think your camera is not working, so we can hear you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, all good.
Yeah, okay. I'll try to be articulate, and do cut me off. I'm happy to be cut off. I like my sympathies for what Ant is saying, and we can also see this as part of the Russian example, where if you think of a majority of a society and taking control nationally, then fair enough, the Bolsheviks had the majority of the working class vote, but then the working class within Russia were a tiny minority. My contention with him, though, there was about majority parties or mass parties. I think that's the phrase that he used. And it essentially, to transform and take change society, you need a majority on board. And I'm sure he's got some thoughts himself. Then, don't want wishy-washy things being lowest common denominator. But in my mind, in terms of even like the CPGB's minimum program and stuff, the real way of either a challenge or seizure of power can only occur really with the consent and the organization per meeting completely through society. So yes, of course, the whole of society or a majority of society would not need the membership of the party, but without it then, at least on a state level, being to a sufficient level to overcome what's against us, things are going to turn bad and very, very quickly. And I think with the Russian example, for example, that was based on the hope or a risk or a belief that they'd only succeed if it, by standing as example, it would spread to the rest of the imperial centers, especially in Europe. And then so it was a risk, but it was also a state that was crumbling, like nationalize the banks. The banks were already owned by Britain and stuff like that. And perhaps on a world scale, we've got a better opportunity now compared to the Russian example because so many people live in cities, they're not peasants. But to me, going back to the start, and my final thought then, mass parties are necessary, and as the speakers have said, they won't look visually like they did, but really, in order to run and develop a society, you need the whole of society moving along with things. So, yeah, thank you. I'm done there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachin. Back to you, Andrew. While answering those questions, perhaps you could also think of a way to summarize sort of the key aspects of the SPD that we could perhaps still use today. And the Bolsheviks also obviously took, we were looking at that at next session, but what are in your view, the key issues that we should take away from this? Thank you.
Thanks, Tina. I mean, yeah, in response to Sachin, there's a few issues flagged there. I mean, one of the ways in which the SPD leaders thought they could come to power, and they always quote Engels in one of his last prefaces to the class struggles in France on this, that if their electoral support kept growing in every election at the rate it had been, and they also thought the working class would continue to get larger and larger and encompass more and more of German society, they would kind of naturally grow into the situation where they could take over the state. And then when November 1918 happened and the old state machinery, the monarchy, not the machinery, but the monarchy collapsed, there was a lack of imagination by the party leadership to actually take advantage of the objectively revolutionary situation to clear away some of the furniture of the old regime and create the basis for a genuine socialist democracy. Despite the schmozzle they make of it, the Social Democrats and Independents between them still get about 46% of the vote in January 1919, which then meant they were sharing power with the bourgeoisie. But it's that failure of imagination in November 1918 that I think is worth focusing on as well. And dynamic situations happen. I'm surprised that people have been talking about the repressive British state. And no one's mentioned Donald Trump, maybe because that is too horrible to contemplate. But, you've got this extraordinary, far-right takeover of the American, system of government from within. And that's going to create dynamic and unforeseeable situations. And we don't know how it's going to play out yet. So I think, there's incrementalism, there's electoral strategies, but there's also, dynamic, unpredictable situations and how you respond to that with imagination and trying to create revolutionary possibilities that you didn't foresee. That's, one of the other lessons, I guess, from the SPD. If you continue don't stop the story in August 1918, but follow it down to January 1919 and what they failed to do in November 1918. So I don't know if that helps with Sachin's comment on Matthews. There's a lot packed into Matthews' comments. Again, it's the regional diversity of Germany. You have much more reformism and gradualism in the southwest of Germany. And like Baden is a much more liberal state. It has a constitution, so half a century before Prussia does, for example, and less repressive government. And you've got attempts by South German and Southwest German governments to collaborate with bourgeois parties at the state level. But that's hitting a brick wall by 1914, as the other parties just don't want to cede power to the Social Democrats, even in the moderately liberal parts of Germany. And on religion, I mean, the Social Democrats are a rival for, say, Catholic miners in the Ruhr when there's a big strike on, trying to get them on board. But the Catholic labor movement still remains a minority in Germany, and the Social Democrats' policy on religion it's a private matter. We don't want to get into what people's religion is, which, this is in a state where you had an established church and still a fairly radical position. Some people argued the Social Democrats should have been more militantly atheist, but they're also trying not to scare away those Catholic miners in the Ruhr. On William's points, I think the Copenhagen conference was the last one before the war, not Stuttgart, but there was no consensus at Stuttgart on Edouard Vaillant's anti-militarist motion, because Vaillant is saying there should be a general strike when war breaks out. And even Hugo Haase, who is on the left of the Social Democrats, said that won't work in Germany because the army will just crush us. They'll declare martial law, and in 24 hours, all our leaders will be locked up in army barracks. Which was a very real possibility in Germany. So they're quite well aware of the legal and military means the state had in their hands in Germany. So the Germans don't commit to a general strike in the event of war because they are aware of the legal situation in Germany. But you mentioned Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg goes to jail because she says in a speech in Frankfurt that if speaking to workers in Frankfurt in early 1914, if you are ordered to fire on your French brothers, don't do it. And she gets a lengthy prison term, and again, it's fortress imprisonment. It's not an ordinary criminal jail. It's the political prisoners' more lenient form of jail, but it's still jail, and she's still out of political action for a long time during the First World War. So you could call on people, on soldiers, not to fight, not to shoot on their comrades and fellow workers from France, but you'd get a year in jail. So that's the historical situation. Again, there are sort of real disadvantages of having a repressive class state, as well as the benefits of solidarity and morale.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Fascinating session. I think it showed really that when we're being told Marxism, it doesn't work for today, etc. I mean, things have changed, no doubt, but clearly it mobilized 1 million people into forming a real party with its own differences, etc. and contradictions. But certainly the minimum maximum program was certainly, in our view, was very instrumental in making it that successful. You have a vision of actually where you're going, not it'll sort of automatically get to it. Also, I think the Socialist Democratic Party, as described, took high politics seriously. It got involved on every level. It didn't say, "Oh, we'll leave that to the liberals." Took every question seriously and tried to formulate an answer, and also organized a state within a state. Start building your own structures in the here and now as a way to mobilize the majority for revolution. It's been a really interesting session. Thank you very much, Andrew. Next week, we're continuing this theme, and we'll be discussing with Lars T. Lee the question of how the Social Democrats influenced the Bolsheviks, and with it, obviously, the Russian Revolution. So really important second session following on from that. Thank you very much, Andrew. Thanks for all your questions and comments, comrades. Really good session. Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, Tina. Thanks, everyone.